This is a reading from Akita, the Tears and Message of Mary. Witnesses. Afterwards, 11 of the men from Tokyo participated in an interview for the Catholic Graph in the name of all the eyewitnesses of these days. Their testimony was reproduced later in a work entitled Messages of a Heavenly Voice. Here are some of the testimonies. Testimony of Mr. Shingi Saigusa, lawyer. After Mass, we went to dinner at the house of St. Joseph, where the men were staying. It was already late, perhaps 9:30. We were at table when a telephone call from the convent alerted us that the statue was crying again. Father Yasuda told us, "She is crying at this moment. What shall we do?" Instinctively, everybody arose from the table to run to the chapel. Indeed, the tears flowed from the eyes of the statue. As for me, who was the first to arrive, I wept with sobs in my voice. I was near the foot of the altar when the rosary began, but I was unable to repress my tears, which flowed without stopping. I believe that the statue shed more tears this day than the day before. After the prayer, we returned to the house of St. Joseph to finish dinner, but no one spoke further, and a great emotion reigned around the table. Witness of Mr. Mitsuo Kawashima. The next day, a little after midday, we sat down at table when the news came. We were then witnesses a second time. The tears of the night before had left traces on the face, and new drops streamed on the cheeks. Witness of Mr. Isao Suzuki. Having had technical training, I have a tendency to learn everything by reasoning. I am of those who prefer natural explanations to supernatural phenomena. Also, the first time that I saw the tears, I asked myself at once if it was not due to the rain which had humidified the wood. It was at the second lacrimation that I truly experienced a shock. There was no natural explanation possible. Witness of Mr. Eiji Hiroi. When I heard the news, I also asked if it was not humidity because of the weather. And when I understood that this could not be the case, as I observed the phenomenon more closely, I thought of the possibility of some fakery with a syringe. However, the second time, I clearly saw the tears flowing from the pupils and streaming one after the other. This time I could not remain insensible before a prodigy which surpassed all human comprehension. Testimony of Mr. Simon Miyata, university professor. The second time, I do not know how to describe what I felt at the sight of the drops, which appeared in the corner of the eyes, giving off beautiful, luminous reflections before purling on the cheek. Witness of Mr. Kiyokazu Fuji. The first time, it was so unexpected that I remained stupefied. I had prayed the rosary, asking pardon for my sins, though I could not raise my eyes, and looked simply at the tears streaming near the feet without looking in greater detail. The second time I observed attentively. Large drops formed beads which flowed from the left eye onto the cheek, and I had the feeling of being face to face with a prodigy in which no human artifice was involved. Witness of Mr. Tadao Moriguchi. I was also very impressed the first time, and I could not observe the tears attentively, but I was not yet convinced that evening. When it had happened the next day, I looked closely. It is not something which one can explain by invoking simple, natural, or psychic causes. Even for an atheist, it is inadmissible to decree that what one does not understand cannot exist, and to deny a priori without asking questions about what one has seen with one's own eyes. I hope that what I saw, the supernatural force manifested before me, has served to increase my faith. Witness of Mr. Yasuhiro Izaki, president of a company. Certainly I had reason to go to Akita, but in no way did I expect to see the tears of the Virgin. Evidently, I was ready to believe in the miraculous events concerning the blood, the perspiration, the perfumes, but I did not have the least pretension, furthermore unthought of, to go verify them myself. I indeed saw tears appear and accumulate at the corner of the eyes and fall silently along the cheeks. I immediately prostrated myself, forgetting the world around me. I had the very strong feeling that all of our little personal affairs and the desires related to them are futile and vain. Was it an inspiration of heaven? God has hidden these things from the learned and the wise, and has revealed them to little ones. The Bible teaches us, I am filled with fear at the thought that the all-powerful God has manifested himself to us, to the nothingness that I am. Faith is not a part of an individual, and still less an accessory. It must concern the entire personality and all our actions. This is what I profoundly felt because of this experience. Witness of Mr. Fumio Ono. After the first lacrimation, I discussed it that evening with Mr. Hiroi, and we raised the possibility of fakery with a syringe. The second time, while trying to keep my sang-froid, I told myself, don't become eccentric. I decided to look seriously. The tears formed and flowed without stopping. I approached very close to assure myself better. Then I understood that it was not something to doubt, and I prayed the rosary with the others. Witness of Mr. Hiroshi Kawasaki. The second time, I approached within 30 centimeters, about 1 foot from the statue, and I saw tears large as a grain of rice coming forth from the right eye and fall, throwing off reflections of light. It was of a beauty which human artifice, even though artistic, could not express. Had I been alone, I would have been tempted to take the drops which had fallen to the foot of the statue and place them on my rosary. After citing the above testimony, the editor of Catholic Graph added, the 11 witnesses have different attitudes. Some say that they will always repeat the same testimony without ever changing a word, and others are more reserved and think that one must speak of this with prudence, taking into account the dispositions of the person to whom we speak. But all are unanimous in saying one cannot deny the events of Yuzo Wadai, nor take them lightly, and that they require a local inquiry whose results ought to be made public as soon as possible. As for myself, I had been witness of the lacrimations of the 2 days, except for the second because I had gone to the city, and I have already described what I saw, and since then I have often spoken of this to numerous visitors who come to pray at the convent. It seems that the events of this day, the feast of St. Joseph and First Saturday, merit a more special attention as suggested by the words of the angel. The exhortation to attach a greater importance to this day appears like the assurance that the devotion to St. Joseph pleases the Lord and to the importance of the first Saturdays. Heaven wishes to encourage each one to bring this into daily life. But what stands out with particular importance in the words of the angel is the pressing invitation to put the messages of Our Lady into practice. As we have remarked once before, could heaven go to any greater lengths to attract our attention and impress us with the importance of this message, manifested through the tears and urgent importance to each and every one of us? Chapter 14, the Church and the Media. The 13th of May is a date when Catholics around the world commemorate the first apparition of Our Lady of Fatima. For this day, Pope John XXIII instituted the liturgy of the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary of Fatima. On the 13th of May of 1976, Mr. and Mrs. Keisuke Yamauchi, journalist and editor of the Catholic Graph, were privileged witnesses to a lacrimation. It was a year and a half before that the Catholic Graph had published a series of articles on the Virgin of Akita. Other magazines and newspapers had reprinted the news, and 2 or 3 television networks had shown the statue which weeps on the little screen. Thus, the secular media drew attention of the public to such an extent that the Japanese Catholic press wanted to hear nothing more about it and fell into an obstinate silence on the subject. For my part, I sent exact information to various Catholic centers of information, but nothing was published, so I wrote to the Catholic Graph offering to put all the documents at their disposal. The at least astonishing news of the lacrimations of the Virgin temporarily increased the circulation of the magazine, but at the same time drew upon it the anger of people who were a priori opposed. Mr. Yamauchi often told me of his concern for the future of his work. Since we speak of the Virgin of Akita, the very existence of our review is in danger. Now, on this 13th of May, 1976, Mr. Yamauchi had the providential opportunity to assist himself at a lacrimation. The article in which he relates his experience begins by telling of the difficulties he met in making known the events of Akita. Opposition from within the church was so great that he confesses that he did not know how he could continue because of his feeble resources. He added, This work became for me above all an insupportable burden. On this 13th of May, when he came to the convent, Mr. Yamauchi had already prepared the next issue of Catholic Graph, in which he was going to publish the interviews of the 11 witnesses of the lacrymations of the 1st and 2nd of May. The 1st of May was not only the feast of St. Joseph the Worker, but also the first Saturday of the month. Now, less than 2 weeks later, having taken the decision to publish these testimonies, he relates the state of despondency which he felt when he arrived at Akita. He confided to us the bitter complaint he addressed to Mary as he prostrated before her statue. I put myself out to try to bring to life a Catholic journal in the service of loyal and honest information, but the result is that I am at the end of my strength. I can do no more. I believe that it is thanks to your miraculous help that we have been able to avoid failure to the present day. I thank your grace for that. But the collective interview which I am preparing to publish will finally do nothing but repeat that such and such a one has seen this and that. Then, if these facts are authentic, give me the grace to be among the witnesses. Would I not have much more to say with much more credibility? But it is you that will decide, and not I. May it be done according to your will. But as for me, I can do no more. The divine response. Mr. and Mrs. Yamauchi took the train from Tokyo the night before, and they arrived in Yuzawadai in the morning after breakfast and Eucharistic adoration. Briefly, these are the circumstances which brought Mr. Yamauchi to witness the tears of Mary. First, his wife had pointed to the holy water font at the entrance of the chapel. "It has a fragrance," she said. "Not especially," he answered. Then she wet her finger and made the sign of the cross several times. "It is true. More now," she added. That afternoon, both of them went to the chapel, which seemed empty. Looking at the statue to the right of the altar, Mr. Yamauchi saw not only the face, but the entire body giving off a white light. Remembering that the statue had been dark when he saw it in the morning, he called his wife and went closer. I came as close as 10 centimeters, to observe a drop of water shone on the end of the nose. Large, round drops had stopped on the right cheek. The right eye was wet and shooting off reflections, and from the lower lid began the trace of a thread of water developing into drops. Drawing back, I exclaimed, "She weeps!" My wife sat down, saying that she was afraid. My eyes did not leave the statue, and all sorts of thoughts filled my mind. Gathering himself together, Mr. Yamauchi wanted to recite a Hail Mary, but his voice was too broken with emotion, and he could not. When he began to pray more slowly, his wife began to cry with great sobs. She recounts that she prayed for the first time in her life with a truly childlike heart, and that she felt the presence of God very close to her at that moment. Shortly after, Mr. Yamauchi hastened to find me in my office, and I at once followed him to the chapel. On that day, 20 parishioners of Akita had come to participate in a day of recollection. At the announcement of the news, they all assembled in the chapel, and we were witnesses of the phenomenon. As in preceding times, I led the rosary. When it was over, the areas wet with tears retained a reddish color clearly visible. Mr. Yamauchi describes the condition of the statue in his article. When we were coming to the end of the rosary, the water which had accumulated at the neck disappeared from our eyes in the space of an instant. They disappear, I said to myself, looking at this strange phenomenon which unfolded before me as in a film. From the place where I was, I cannot verify what happened to the tears on the cheek and on the chin, but I very well observed the change which took place at the level of the neck. When the phenomenon was over, he felt that it was the response of God to his prayer, and at the same time, an encouragement to continue to publish the review, no matter what it cost. It is thus that the Catholic Graph continued to appear for many years. Growing trials. Opposition and criticism flowed from all sides, as Catholic Graph informed the public about the weeping of the statue of Akita, giving the miracle the importance which it deserved. Bishop Ito, the highest religious person responsible with regard to these events, was not one to simply observe the situation in a passive way. 1 year before, he had asked the priest, who was well known for research in Mariology, to cooperate in an inquiry. This priest came in person to Yuzawadai, where he had interviews with the sisters, and asked Sister Agnes, whom he had been observing, to lend him her intimate journal. He said that the articles that I had furnished until that time did not permit objective judgment because they presented everything in a favorable light, without any allusion to what might be negative. After a moment of reflection, I told Sister Agnes that she could give him the journal, judging that it was not proper to withhold anything whatever, if that could be useful for discerning the truth. It was a year later that the intimate journal was returned and in reality had been used to show that the sister was a psychopath using ectoplasmic powers. This marked the beginning of a most sorrowful period, not only for Sister Agnes, but for all of us. It was only 8 years later that the accusation would fall with the publication of the pastoral letter of the bishop, after much more detailed inquiries. Translator's note. At this point in his book, Father Yasuda speaks at some length of the terrible trial which ensued not just for days or weeks, but for several years. While it fills only a few pages, certainly all the encouragement of Our Lady and the angel was necessary to come through this terrible time. One is put in mind of the sufferings of Lucia after the apparitions of Fatima, when she was repeatedly taken to the priest by her mother and told to confess that she had lied, even to the point of having been beaten several times and accused of leading her entire family to disgrace and ruin. 4 days after the visit of Mr. and Mrs. Yamauchi, this same priest, whom we shall call the Inquisitor, came to preach at Week's retreat. Bishop Ito agreed with this because he had asked this priest to cooperate in that inquiry, and he thought that his meeting with the community would facilitate the task. As for me, I had been invited to go speak at a church in Suzuka of the prefecture of Maiya, and I took advantage to do this during the time of the retreat. Without doubt, by any effect of divine providence, Sister Agnes was called to the bedside of her dying mother in her native village and had to leave the convent the first day of the retreat, and thus the Inquisitor had an open field to give free course to his verve for a whole week. When I returned from the trip, I was surprised by the leaden silence and the heavy atmosphere which reigned among the sisters. Several days passed, and the following Sunday they came to find me in my office after breakfast. They began by explaining that the Inquisitor had caused them to doubt everything. They had been obliged to agree that they had no argument to oppose his coherent and structured demonstration, according to which everything was the result of ectoplasmic powers of Sister Agnes, who had to be a psychopath, and, everything considered, there was no other solution than to take the side of the Inquisitor. For the moment, I protested vigorously. What idiocy! But I soon realized that it was fruitless to try to deny a theory based on a third-person report. I had to meet the Inquisitor in person to understand his so convincing arguments. As I reflect upon it, there was nothing surprising in the fact that the first conviction of the sisters was overcome before the large-worded interpretations of a theologian strong in Marian questions. It was a total impasse, and I was deeply disturbed. Even the trees and flowers of the Garden of Mary no longer brought joy to my heart. Everything seemed covered with a gray veil, which seemed to block out any prospect of solution. I had doleful states of soul when I thought how fragile can be our human convictions. So 2 days later, I went to see the Inquisitor in Tokyo with 2 superiors of the convent. We were received in the parlor of the Institute of Theology for an interview which lasted 2 hours. The Inquisitor gave us the explanations which follow, citing his detailed inquiry in which he sifted the intimate journal of Sister Agnes. His study revealed that since Sister Agnes was a psychopath from birth, she had already manifested ectoplasmic powers before being converted to Christianity, and that these powers had resurfaced after her conversion. The wound which appeared on the hand of the statue, the blood which flowed, the phenomena of perspiration and lacrimation, all could be explained by the so-called ectoplasm which she had. That is to say, that she was able to transfer her own blood upon the hand of the statue, and the same with the tears. He had an air of certainty of what he said, and cited as support the occult practices of certain Buddhist sects. When he was finished speaking, I said to myself that the object of my research would have to now bear on the question of knowing what precise relation of cause and effect existed between the so-called powers of the sister and the objective phenomena we witnessed on the statue. The theory of this renowned theologian satisfied me not at all. For his part, bearing the primary responsibility in the church, Bishop Ito began to feel the urgency of concrete action and decided to ask the advice of the Apostolic Nuncio. The latter suggested that he ask the Archbishop of Tokyo for the creation of the Commission of Canonical Inquiry without delay. So, a commission was officially created and the inquisitor, whose position was already well known, was named president. On the order of the commission, Bishop Ito made an official declaration in the Catholic Journal, official press organ of the Japanese Church, forbidding all public manifestation of veneration towards the statue of the Virgin of Akita. At the same time, Sister Agnes was called by the inquisitor to answer to a long interrogation. It lasted an entire day, during which she was forced to hear argument upon argument, undergoing a true brainwashing. The inquisitor had already explained over and over, and to numerous personalities from different areas, that he thought of Sister Agnes, calling her a special psychopathic case, characterized by a dissociation, the visions which she said to have been seen of the guardian angel being only a manifestation of her double personality, of which she herself was the dupe. And he added that her spiritual director used her for writing articles in the media and accumulating benefices, which was an inadmissible sin. But this did not prevent him from welcoming Sister Agnes with open arms, without a single word of reproach, and even with a strong mark of affection worthy of a father. Was it to gain her favor? Sister Agnes relates, "When I arrived, accompanied by my brother and my sister, he, the inquisitor, welcomed us with open arms and a warm smile. We were very moved by his very paternal kindness. He had a very nice breakfast prepared for us. Then we found ourselves alone, face to face, and I had to listen to the development of his arguments from morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, without the time to breathe. I saw coming the moment when I was going to be squarely labeled mentally ill, but this word was not pronounced a single time. It was when he declared that I had ectoplasmic powers that I began seriously to be disturbed. To my question as to what he meant by that, he explained at length that that came from the subconscious, and so on, and that all the mysterious phenomena were due to my subconscious action. Then that comes from the devil? In these conditions, I pray you to drive them from me. It is not the devil. There is no fault on your part, because it is subconscious. But I cannot be a victim of this monstrosity, and since you say that I abuse very many people in this way, it is a frightening thing. I beg you, free me from these powers. In any event, it is not you who are at fault. One can say that the responsibility falls on your superior, who took this story of the angel seriously from the beginning, and that let this snowball. The words of the angel, it is you who recount them to yourself. He exhorted me to pay no more attention to these apparitions. However, the guardian angel appeared to me during the Mass at 11 o'clock, which followed, although I did not expect her there. I hastily closed my eyes not to pay attention, but I immediately heard her voice which said, "Do not fear." And from that, I had a feeling of indescribable peace. At the beginning of the afternoon interview, I explained that the angel had come again, and he told me that this was altogether normal, because that could not stop all of a sudden since the time I had these visions, but that everything would soon return to order because he was there to direct me, and the sermon began in the same style. The thing which upset me the most in what he said, even supposing that I was not at fault, was that I was abusing a great number of people. At the end, I felt myself completely battered down, and my sister advised by telephone came to get me with a taxi. In the taxi, I was asking myself if I would come out of this alive, emptied as I was of all energy. I did not want to even look at the dinner which my sister had prepared for me with such solicitude, and taking my head in my hands, my face resting on the table, I jumped when I felt a strange sensation on my fingers. My hair had literally stood up on my head, without doubt because of the fear. It was completely stiffened by grease and sweat, as though someone had planted stiff needles which my fingers could not penetrate. After a frightened instant, I took hold of myself suddenly, as if waking from a sleep. "What are you about? And you imagine that you have the faith? Nothing happens without permission of God. And does he not know it all? Is it not to be the victim of oneself, tormenting the soul like that?" This light suddenly freed me, and I almost felt like laughing, because the situation was truly funny. When I lifted up my hands again in the midst of a laugh, wet with tears, my hair had regained its suppleness. The next day, thanks to the good care of Bishop Ito, I was hospitalized for a complete examination of my physical and psychic state. I stretched out on the bed at the end of my strength. For 3 days, the doctors kept going and coming, and I was unable either to eat or to raise myself. 3 weeks later, 2 sisters took me to a thermal station for a period of convalescence. When I returned to the convent after having regained my strength, I found there was an ambiance completely different from what it had been before. From this day on, I had the impression of walking on needles. When I think of it now, I wonder how I ever survived alive. At the moment of hospitalization, I was in a state of extreme moral and physical exhaustion. I said to myself more than once that I would indeed be happier if the good God would call me to himself at once. One must realize that this account rather minimizes the reality, the memories being strongly diminished with the passage of the years after that shock of spiritual direction. In appearance, the people were gentle. The doctors at the hospital never spoke to her openly about mental illness themselves and persistently told her that she was normal, while in the report sent to the canonical commission, they referred to a specific case of hysteria. At the convent, the superior and the other sisters treated her kindly, but she knew too well that her credibility was reduced to nothing, and she was considered with doubt in all that she did. She confided to me later that she clung with all her strength to the words that I whispered to her. Christ on the cross was rejected and abandoned by all. Thus for her began long days of trial and moral solitude in the midst of general misunderstanding.